and welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Anusha Bala, and I am a proud supporter of the Free Library. It is my honor to introduce Mohsin Hamid and Pankaj Mishra. Before we get started, please take a moment to turn off your cell phones or silence it or whatever you need to do, and please join us after the lecture for a book signing in the lobby. Mohsin Hamid is the internationally best-selling author of novels Moth Smoke, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, and How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia, and the essay collection Discontent and Its Civilizations. Born in Lahore, Pakistan, he has spent about half of his life there and much of the rest in California, New York, and London. His writing has been featured on bestseller lists, adapted for the screen, shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, and selected as a winner or finalist of 20 awards, and translated into 35 languages. His latest novel, Exit West, is about a young couple in a city slowly being overtaken by militants and extremists. The city is unnamed, but in many ways resembles Lahore. The novel follows the couple as they are forced to join a wave of migrants fleeing for their lives, seeking out one of the mysterious doors that transport people to faraway countries. Part ripped from the headlines and part magical realism, Exit West feels ominously relevant, painting a nuanced portrait of contemporary migration, from the horrors of Western hysteria to what it really means to leave one's life behind in hopes of building another. Pankaj Mishra is a British Indian author and writer of literary and political essays. He has written several books, including Temptations of the West, How to Be Modern in India, Pakistan, and Beyond, From the Ruins of Empire, The Revolt Against the West and the Remaking of Asia, and A Great Clamour, Encounters with China and Its Neighbors. A Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, one of Foreign Policy Magazine's top 100 global thinkers, and a winner of Yale's Windham-Campbell Literature Prize, he is a columnist at the Bloomberg View and the New York Times Book Review, and writes regularly for The Guardian, the London Review of Books, and the New Yorker, to name some of the publications. Others are too numerous to name. In his latest work, Age of Anger, A History of the Present, he attempts to explain the origins of the great wave of paranoid hatred that seems inescapable in our world today. From American shooters and ISIS to Donald Trump, the rise in vengeful nationalism across the world, and the pervasive racism and misogyny that happen on social media. He takes a look back to the 18th century and shows us that as the world became modern, those who were unable to enjoy its promises of freedom, stability, and prosperity were increasingly susceptible to demagogues. It was from among the ranks of those disaffected that the militants of the 19th century arose. He explains how today, just as then, the wide embrace of mass politics, technology, and the pursuit of wealth and individualism has cast many more billions adrift in a demoralized world, uprooted from tradition but still far from modernity, with the same terrible results. Making startling connections and comparisons, Age of Anger has been described as a book of immense urgency and profound argument and a history of our present predicament unlike any other. It's a pleasure to have both of these two accomplished gentlemen here with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Mohsin Hamid and Pankaj Mishra to the Free Library.
Thank you very much, Anusha, for this warm introduction, and thank you all for coming. I'm especially pleased to be sharing a stage with my old friend Mohsin, and also we've been, thinking along about these themes, about the present situation and how we got there for a long time. So it's wonderful to be sharing this platform with him and coming at our present moment from different angles in different genres. This book, Age of Anger, I started to write in 2014 after the election victory of Narendra Modi in India. A man, I think perhaps for many of you who don't know him or have not heard of him, it's probably enough to say that he's a man who should ideally be in prison, but is now the Prime Minister of India, the world's largest democracy. And his election, like the election of the man who shall remain unmentioned, hopefully, throughout this evening, was a great source of shock, despair, bewilderment to all of us, many of us in India. And it really, in a way, forced me to write this book, simply in order, in the first instance, to sort out my own perplexity, to answer many of the questions. This victory, this empowerment of a demagogue through democratic means posed to me. So this book is an attempt to really answer many of these questions that have now become, as I began to write, increasingly became global questions. How did we arrive here? What happened? And one of the arguments I make in the book is that we have been focused for too long, and I think with calamitous results, on defining current crisis or disorder with, or in religious terms, using a certain kind of outdated vocabulary of religious conflict or religious extremism. So, for instance, after 9/11, we started to locate the roots of terrorist violence in Islam, forgetting the long history of terrorism which starts in the late 19th century, which includes all kinds of people from all different national backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, religious backgrounds. So this notion that terrorism, terroristic violence, militant violence is peculiar to a particular religion or a particular community defined by that religion was utterly puerile. And we are beginning to recognize that now, since bigotry and fundamentalisms of various sorts have erupted in the heart of the modern West, and we quickly recognize that that's actually very little to do with religion or the practice of religion, that there are many different factors at work here, socio-economic, political. So in order to illustrate this argument, I decided in this book to write about a figure that perhaps all of you have heard of, a figure not much invoked in recent years or recent months, but who I think of as a precursor to the man who will remain unmentioned, and that is Timothy McVeigh, who I think is a fascinating figure, who I don't feel has been discussed enough in connection with other forms of terrorism that we've seen in the world since he killed nearly 200 people back in '95. So I'm going to read from a chapter which is not entirely devoted to him, but it talks about the roots of terrorism, and it describes the modern history of terrorism and just where exactly it springs from, what we can expect in the future. In April 1995, Timothy McVeigh drove a rider rental truck to the front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. He had already lit 2 fuses of 5 and 2 minutes each. Leaving the truck just below a daycare center in the building, he walked away as a large explosion behind him destroyed the north half of a building, killing 168 people, including 19 children, and injuring 684 others. It was the first large-scale attack by a domestic terrorist in the United States. The list has radically expanded in recent years, but in its scale, Oklahoma still dwarfs the killings at the Boston Marathon, Charleston, Chattanooga, Austin, Fort Hood, San Bernardino, and Orlando. Muslim terrorists were initially suspected of carrying out the attack on the federal building. There was some surprise when McVeigh, a veteran of the First Gulf War, was arrested and charged with mass murder. The son of divorced parents and a devotee of Chuck Norris and Rambo movies, McVeigh seemed to be the victim of a fantasy of what Barack Obama in his memoir called swaggering American manhood. He had railed against feminism. He believed that political correctness had pampered African Americans. The National Rifle Association, in his view, was too weak to preserve the Second Amendment. The United Nations, together with the government of the United States, was taking over the world. Amassing guns, McVeigh had seen himself as a noble survivalist. His prosecutors depicted him as a lone and psychotic killer with no known connections to terrorist groups. It's a charge commonly brought against white perpetrators of mass violence in the United States, although, as we know, quite a lot of slaughter is avowedly ideological and targeted at symbols of political power. Jared Loughner, for instance, who murdered 6 people during a failed assassination attempt on Congresswoman Gabrielle Gifford, claimed to be on a crusade against Federalist laws, while Dylan Roof, who killed 9 people at a church in South Carolina, attended mostly by African Americans, said he had hoped to incite a race war. The accusation did not quite fit McVeigh, who had drifted through various loose networks of white men linked by their extreme hatred and suspicion of the federal government. During his trial and afterwards, he produced a laundry list of their grievances: the FBI raid on Waco, Texas, US military actions against smaller nations, no-knock search warrants, high taxation, and gun control laws. McVeigh's arguments against the state are by no means unfamiliar or exotic today. It is never a sign of extremism in America to believe that the government is the greatest enemy of individual freedom. Several generations of conservative politicians have asserted the same and have been hailed for their wisdom. But McVeigh's rhetoric of freedom from arbitrary and opaque authority had a much wider resonance and appeal outside as well as inside the United States. In the most illuminating coincidence of our time, at a supermax prison in Colorado, McVeigh befriended Ramzi Ahmed Yusuf, the mastermind of the first attack on World Trade Center in 1993. Born to a Pakistani man and Palestinian woman and educated in Kuwait and Wales, Yusuf came from the first generation of jihadis not tied to specific countries or regions. These were people globalized willy-nilly by their failing, or in the case of Palestine, non-existent states. Yusuf was not a devout Muslim like many other terrorists who followed in his blood-splattered wake, including most recently Omar Mateen, who killed 49 people at a gay club in Orlando. Yusuf had learned to make bombs in one of Osama bin Laden's camps in Afghanistan. In 1993, he placed his explosives under the World Trade Center's North Tower, hoping that it would collapse spectacularly into the South Tower, bringing the twin buildings down and killing 350,000 people. He flew back disappointed to Pakistan, where he planned and tried out various other prodigal schemes of mass murder, as much aimed at television ratings as a high kill rate. Yusuf's uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, an engineer by training, completed what he had started, the Twin Towers' destruction. Mohammed is now known as the chief architect of the 9/11 attacks. But it was his nephew who first gave modern terrorism its passion for grandiosity. Denouncing the United States at his trial, Yusuf anticipated McVeigh's justification for his crime, saying, "You killed civilians and innocent people, not soldiers, innocent people in every single war. You went to more wars than any country in the century. And then you have the nerve to talk about killing innocent people?" The points of contact between radical Islamists and McVeigh may have been accidental. Yusuf happened to be in a cell adjacent to McVeigh's at their supermax prison. But in the age of the internet, people with diverse historical and political backgrounds only have to exchange Snapchat videos in order to initiate new journeys. Using online outreach, the cyber propagandists of ISIS have managed to seduce thousands of foreign novices into making a perilous journey to the Middle East and North Africa. The Norwegian, Anders Behring Breivik, the first of the mass murderers spawned by the internet, sought a common front with Hindu fanatics, among many others, in his worldwide campaign against multiculturalist governments. He, in turn, inspired the German-Iranian teenager who shot dead 9 people in Munich in July 2016. Anwar al-Awlaki did not kill anyone, but managed to provoke terrorist attacks in Boston and Paris with his internet sermons alone. McVeigh went to his death defending Yusuf and Osama bin Laden. They were, he said in his last interviews, people merely responding to the crimes of the United States against the rest of the world. Had he lived, McVeigh might have followed, in his mind at least, the trajectory of many militants of white Caucasian origins, from John Philip Walker Lind, the Californian captured fighting with the Taliban against the US in Afghanistan, to the numerous American and European devotees of ISIS. In one of his last recorded messages to the West in 2006, Osama bin Laden himself appeared to have moved on in his bookish exile from his grievances with US foreign policy and Islamic theology to anxieties about global warming and the inability of a Western democracy hijacked by global interests to prevent it. Anwar al-Awlaki, exhorting DIY jihad to his listeners, invoked the examples of African Americans who he said had to go through a struggle their rights were not handed to them. That's how slavery ended, and the struggle has to continue. Abu Musab al-Suri, Al-Qaeda's leading strategist, quoted Mao Zedong as frequently as he did the Prophet Muhammad. He ridiculed jihadis who did not learn from Western sources for their failure to, as he put it, think outside the box. Such ideological eclecticism only became possible because all these lone wolves possessed a will to violence and mayhem untrammeled by any fixed doctrine, Islamic or otherwise. Umar Mateen, for instance, could not tell the difference between such bitterly opposed groups as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Hezbollah. His most significant ideological act during his killing spree was checking his Facebook pages and Googling himself. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the spiritual father of ISIS, had been a small-town pimp and drug dealer before he set out to establish a caliphate in Iraq. Such exponents of gangsta Islam hope to eradicate the manifold evils of self and society with a few great strokes. Above all, they believe in what the Russian anarchists called the passion for destruction, which is also a creative passion. Many nation builders and imperialists, from the French Revolution's Jacobins to the regime changes and democracy promoters of today, have arrogated to themselves the monopoly, once reserved to God, of creating the human world and violently removing all obstacles in their way. Stalin, for instance, notoriously justified his carnage with the claim that you can't make omelette without breaking eggs. In 2006, as Israel pulverized Lebanon, the US Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, offered a Bush administration spin on Stalin's revolutionary amoralism. The bombs were, she said, part of the birth pangs of a new Middle East. However, men like McVeigh, Yusuf, and Mateen challenged the assumption that a freely willing human subject is motivated by certain desires, beliefs, and perceived benefits, and has an omelette in mind when he breaks eggs, a new man or a new Middle East. For them, the act of violence is all. They have no vision of an alternative global political reality on a global or a local scale, like the one of a classless society or an Islamic nation state offered by communists and Iranian revolutionaries in the past, and cultural nationalists and ethnic nationalists in the present. As Musab al-Suri wrote, Al-Qaeda is not an organization, it is not a group, nor do we want it to be. It's a call, a reference, a methodology. Unlike white terrorists, who tend to be accused of being psychopathic lone wolves, or African-American militants charged with racial hatred, the violence of Muslim militants is commonly linked to a history of Islam that goes as far back as its 7th century origins. But such ambitious accounts of doctrinal coherence and continuity are muddled by the fact that today's militants coming from different social backgrounds fit no profile. Many of them are recent converts to Islam, radicalized quickly. Some are de-radicalized just as rapidly. And all of them attest to the sheer velocity of a homogenizing globalization, which makes a settled religious tradition of politics impossible, while making violence unpredictable and ubiquitous. Even the most devout radicals obey the logic of reciprocity and escalating mimetic violence rather than any scriptural imperative. The words and deeds of Al-Qaeda's chieftains clarified that the global terrorist, moving through the West's networks of war, economics, and technology, also regards the whole planet as his theater of action, where he will, as Osama bin Laden said repeatedly, kill your innocent people since you kill ours. The West's just war, launched in response to 9/11, proliferated around the world, resembling global jihad in its ability to communicate through awesome violence alone and its total inability to build any political order where war and peace are clearly defined and distinct. Its pursuit of an absolute, uncompromising enmity ended up generating many more mortal enemies worldwide with a vengeful craving for emulation, such as the killers of ISIS, who dress up their victims in Guantanamo's jumpsuits. ISIS, born during the implosion of Iraq, owes its existence more to Operation Infinite Justice and enduring freedom. It is the quintessential product of a radical process of globalization in which governments, unable to protect their citizens from foreign invaders, brutal police, or economic turbulence, lose their moral and ideological legitimacy, creating a space for such non-state actors as armed gangs, mafia, vigilante groups, warlords, and private revenge seekers. ISIS aims to create a caliphate, but like American regime changes, it cannot organize a political space, as distinct from privatizing violence. Motivated by a selfie individualism, the adepts of ISIS are better at destruction than creation. Ultimately, a passion for grand politics, which is manifest in their Wagnerian-style annihilation, is what drives the caliphate. The will to power and the craving for violence as existential experience reconcile the varying religious and ideological commitments of its adherents. The attempts to place them in a long Islamic tradition miss how much these militants, feverishly stylizing their murders and rapes on Instagram, reflect an ultimate stage in the radicalization of the modern principle of individual autonomy and equality, a form of strenuous self-assertion that acknowledges no limits and requires descent into a moral abyss. The suicide killers of ISIS, who simultaneously break two fundamental prohibitions of suicide and murder, move from feelings of misery, guilt, righteousness, and impotence to what Theodor Herzl called admiringly, the voluptuousness of a great idea and of martyrdom, a grand vision of heroic self-sacrifice in which a life of freedom can finally be achieved by choosing one's mode of death. These suicide bombers might manufacture religious sanction, but they demonstrate how disconnected a second and third generation of Muslim terrorists are from the Islamic faith practiced by their parents and grandparents. Bin Laden and his deputy showed, even through their distortions, some elementary first-hand knowledge of Islamic traditions and history. But Abu Musab al-Zarqawi seemed to know nothing at all about them. Almost all of the young men involved in recent terror attacks in Europe and America have no religious education and have rarely visited a mosque. Their knowledge of Islamic tradition and theology does not exceed the pages of Islam for Dummies. Nearly all have an extensive background in petty criminality, not to mention banal but nonetheless un-Islamic levels of drunken carousing and drug taking. Liberated from the past and its moral constraints, these wandering outlaws of their own dark mind are free to dream up new forms of self-definition. Their seemingly uncontrollable energy is manifested as much in intensified individualism as in political avant-gardism. Moving through the mundane places and practices of everyday life, motels, bars, gyms, internet chat rooms, Facebook posts, YouTube videos, Twitter timelines, private car rentals, and in Aulaki's case, glamorous escort services, global jihadists as well as domestic terrorists are unmistakably a product of the modern era. Its technologies of communication and advertising, its fears of the loss of will and energy, its stifling of individuality, and its paradoxical imperatives to assert a singular, manly, and energetic self. It is safe to say that there will be many more such men and women in the future, made and unmade by globalization, unmoored to any specific cause or motive, but full of dreams of spectacular violence. Men and women who will bring to politics, life itself, a sense of imminent apocalypse. Thank you.
I can't think of anyone that I'd rather share a stage with tonight than Pankaj. I was listening to him speak and sort of repressing the urge to cheer from time to time. In a way, what Pankaj has just put forward is a critique, an analysis of where we are, and a reframing of where we are that debunks certain certainties about the nature of the condition we find ourselves in. In Exit West, my new novel, what I try to do is to imagine where we might go. One of the great tragedies of the current moment, and something that I'm sure many people in this room feel intimately, is that we have arrived in a political moment where the future, the idea of an optimistic political future, is evading us. It's hard to imagine how we like things to be. If we were 50 years ago, let's say 1967, sitting in Philadelphia having a conversation, and you said to people, how would the future look? They'd probably say it's going to be fantastic. People will be more equal, there'll be more prosperity, wealth will be shared, lives will be lived in amazing and interesting ways. But if you ask people today, articulate, what life would be like in 50 years in a way that you'd like it to be, we'll all struggle. So many of us would struggle to articulate what that would be. And the danger of that is then, if we can't articulate a desirable future, we're left with nostalgia. We're left with depression. We're left with a nostalgic political vision that seeks a restoration of past greatness, an imaginary greatness, whether that's the caliphate of the 8th century or America of the 1950s or Britain before it joined the EU. But everywhere you see this nostalgic political vision. And the deadly nature of that nostalgic political vision is, first of all, things weren't that great, in the 1950s, or Britain before the EU, or the caliphate, the good old days when slaves were slaves. I mean, it's time doesn't work that way. Even if the past is what we imagine the past to be, we can't get there. And the past is not what we imagine it to be. And so one of the things I think fiction can do is fiction can liberate us from the tyranny of what was and what is, and begin to engage in the question of what could be. And in this moment where we have such a failure of optimism and a failure of imagination, I think imagination is a radical political act, an important political act, not just by novelists, but by citizens, by filmmakers, by musicians, by everyone, really. And now, Exit West is a story really about the coming migration apocalypse. It's likely that in the next 2 or 3 centuries, billions of people will move. Sea levels will rise, climate change will occur, and people are going to move. They're already moving. They have always moved. White people are not indigenous to North America. But more significantly, people are not indigenous to North America. We all evolved in Africa, and somehow layer upon layer upon layer has accreted here, and this audience has formed. Why that process should be terrifying to us is a mystery, because that process is us. So Exit West is a novel about the coming migration apocalypse, which investigates the potential that the coming migration apocalypse is not apocalyptic at all. It begins in unnamed city, a lot like my hometown of Lahore, that undergoes terrible events. It undergoes a political reality. Can you guys hear me? I'm speaking, I'm muttering to myself, and people are like, oh. It's fine. Too loud? Okay. How about this? Halfway. Okay, good. So basically, Exit West is set in a city initially much like the city of Lahore, Pakistan, where I live, but undergoing circumstances which are fortunately Lahore has not undergone, but cities like Aleppo and Mosul have undergone, and which any modern city feels like it could potentially undergo. And it's a love story between two characters, Said and Nadia, about which I'll speak a little bit. Let me read you the first couple of pages so you get a sense of how this book works. In a city swollen by refugees but still mostly at peace, or at least not yet openly at war, a young man met a young woman in a classroom and did not speak to her for many days. His name was Said and her name was Nadia, and he had a beard. Not a full beard, more a studiously maintained stubble. And she was always clad from the tips of her toes to the bottom of her jugular notch in a flowing black robe. Back then, people continued to enjoy the luxury of wearing more or less what they wanted to wear, clothing and hair-wise, within certain bounds, of course. And so these choices meant something. It might seem odd that in cities teetering at the edge of the abyss, young people still go to class, in this case an evening class on corporate identity and product branding. But that is the way of things, with cities as with life. For one moment we are pottering about our errands as usual, and the next we are dying. And our eternally impending ending does not put a stop to our transient beginnings and middles until the instant when it does. Said noticed that Nadia had a beauty mark on her neck, a tawny oval that sometimes, rarely, but not never, moved with her pulse. Not long after noticing this, Said spoke to Nadia for the first time. Their city had yet to experience any major fighting, just some shootings and the odd car bombing, felt in one's chest cavity as a subsonic vibration like those emitted by large loudspeakers at music concerts. And Said and Nadia had packed up their books and were leaving class. In the stairwell, he turned to her and said, "Listen, would you like to have a coffee?" And after a brief pause added, to make it seem less forward given her conservative attire, "In the cafeteria." Nadia looked him in the eye. "You don't say your evening prayers?" she asked. Said conjured up his most endearing grin. "Not always, sadly," he said. Her expression did not change, so he persevered, clinging to his grin with the mounting desperation of a doomed rock climber. "I think it's personal. Each of us has his own way, or her own way. Nobody's perfect, and in any case," she interrupted him. "I don't pray," she said. She continued to gaze at him steadily. Then she said, "Maybe another time." He watched as she walked out to the student parking area, and there, instead of covering her head with a black cloth, as he expected, she donned a black motorcycle helmet that had been locked to a scuffed-up 100-ish cc trail bike, snapped down her visor, straddled her ride, and rode off, disappearing with a controlled rumble into the gathering dusk. And that's how it begins. Said and Nadia meet, and they're very different, each from the other. Said is a spiritual man. Nadia is someone who has no real use for organized religion. Said lives with his parents, is quite in love with his family. Nadia has left her family and moved out on her own, something quite unusual for women where she lives. And their city begins to undergo these attacks from these militants, and something strange begins to happen in this world. These doors begin to open, and people begin to move through them. 5 people, 10 people, millions of people, billions of people. And the next 2 or 3 years of the novel, the next 2 or 3 centuries of human migration unfold. And I want to describe to you sort of what going through the doors feels like, because Said and Nadia eventually flee from their city and arrive in Greece. And from there they go to London, and from there they go to Marin County in California, to a new sort of shanty town overlooking San Francisco, people from all over the world. But when they first go, they go through a door like this. It was said in those days that the passage was both like dying and like being born. And indeed, Nadia experienced a kind of extinguishing as she entered the blackness, and a gasping struggle as she fought to exit it. And she felt cold and bruised and damp as she lay on the floor of the room at the other side, trembling and too spent at first to stand. And she thought, while she strained to fill her lungs, that this dampness must be her own sweat. Said was emerging, and Nadia crawled forward to give him room. And as she did so, she noticed the sinks and mirrors for the first time, the tiles of the floor, the stalls behind her, all the doors of which were normal doors, save one, which was black. And she understood that she was in the bathroom of some public place. And she listened intently, but it was silent. The only noises emanating from her breathing, and from Said, passing through the door, his quiet grunts like those of a man exercising or having sex. So Said is coming through this door after Nadia, and they wind up in Greece, and from there they go to London, where there's a backlash against these migrants who are coming in their millions and settling in Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens and inhabiting these mansions that are owned by billionaires, but suddenly being filled by squatters from all over the world. One of the differences between Said and Nadia, we don't have much time, so I'm going to keep this relatively brief and zip through, and then hopefully we'll have a conversation where we can explore some of these elements a bit more. But one of the differences between Said and Nadia is that Said turns to spirituality, to religion for a kind of sustenance, and Nadia just doesn't. I don't believe that between a spiritual tradition and a non-religious tradition that there will ever be one victor. I think that actually both strands are fundamentally human and are likely to coexist. And so I thought, instead of imagining, a battle to the death between the religious and the non-religions, between Islam and the West, between Christianity and whatever, all of which is nonsense, I think. You can manufacture that kind of a conflict, but it's not intrinsic humanity. It's much more interesting to imagine a love story between the two. In what context can the non-believer and the believer fall in love? What can come from that? Does it work? Does it not work? And so I'll just read a little bit about prayer and Said. Said's parents at this point have, well, I shouldn't say. I won't give away the plot, but anyway, let's just say that Said misses them. Now, though, in Marin, Said prayed even more, several times a day. And he prayed fundamentally as a gesture of love for what had gone and would go and could be loved in no other way. When he prayed, he touched his parents, who could not otherwise be touched. And he touched a feeling that we are all children who lose our parents, all of us, every man and woman and boy and girl. And we too will all be lost by those who come after us and love us. And this loss unites humanity, unites every human being. The temporary nature of our beingness and our shared sorrow, the heartache we each carry and yet too often refuse to acknowledge in one another. And out of this, Said felt it might be possible, in the face of death, to believe in humanity's potential for building a better world. And so he prayed as a lament, as a consolation, and as a hope. And this is Said's attitude towards prayer. I think at this moment, so often we think of religion as a politicized identification system. Do you run, Microsoft Windows or the, Apple OS X? Muslims are sort of Apple-based or maybe Microsoft-based, and Christians are Android, and it's just. I think this is an absurdity. It is to confuse the lived experience and the sustenance that people do get from their different faiths with a kind of tribal identity, which is antithetical, really, to that sustenance. And so Said and Nadia, of course, have these difficulties, and I won't tell you what happens to these difficulties, but the novel is about a love story between two people who are very different from each from the other. And the last thing I wanted to say before we sit down and move to questions and answers, although I think we probably desperately overrun. You'll have to walk out as soon as I sit down. But the last thing I wanted to say is another thing that's very important is I don't believe that the world is divided, and I would argue neither should you, between migrants and non-migrants. There's no such thing as a non-migrant. And as an example of this, the novel continually alights upon the stories of minor characters in other places. And I want to read to you this little vignette from the life of an old woman in Palo Alto, near where Said and Marin have arrived in Marin. Said and Nadi have arrived in Marin. Because it comes to the heart of it, which is, I think, the essential nature of the migrant experience, which is a foundational element of what it is to be human, and actually should unite us instead of dividing us into nativists and migrants and, you know, the whole debate that we're having today, which is a debate of absurdity. Not far to the south, in the town of Palo Alto, lived an old woman who had lived in the same house her entire life. Her parents had brought her to this house when she was born, and her mother had passed on there when she was a teenager, and her father when she was in her 20s, and her husband had joined her there, and her 2 children had grown up in this house, and she had lived alone with them when she divorced, and later her second husband, their stepfather, and her children had moved off to her college and not returned, and her second husband had died 2 years ago, and throughout this time she had never moved. Traveled, yes, but never moved. And yet it seemed the world had moved, and she barely recognized the town that existed outside her property. The old woman had become a rich woman on paper, the house now worth a fortune, and her children were always pestering her to sell it, saying she didn't need all that space. But she told them to be patient. It would be theirs when she died. And she said this kindly, to sharpen the bite of it, and to remind them how much they were motivated by money. Money they spent without having, which she had never done, always saving for a rainy day, even if only a little. One of her granddaughters went to the great university nearby, a university that had gone from being a local secret to among the world's most famous in the space of the old woman's lifetime. This granddaughter came to see her, often as much as once a week. She was the only one of the old woman's descendants who did this, and the old woman adored her, and also sometimes felt baffled by her. Looking at her granddaughter, she thought she saw what she would have looked like had she been born in China. For the granddaughters had features of the old woman, and yet to the old woman, overall, more or less, but mostly more, looked Chinese. There was a rise that led up to the old woman's street, and when she was a little girl, the old woman used to push her bike up and then get on and zoom back down without pedaling, bikes being heavy in those days and hard to take uphill, especially when you were small, as she was then, and your bike too big, as hers had been. She had liked to see how far she could glide without stopping, flashing through the intersections, ready to brake, but not overly ready, because there had been a lot less traffic, at least as far as she could remember. She had always had carp in a mossy pond in the back of her house, carp her granddaughter called goldfish, and she had known the names of almost everyone on her street, and most had been there a long time. They were old California, from families that were California families. But over the years, they had changed more and more rapidly, and now she knew none of them, and saw no reason to make the effort. For people bought and sold houses the way they bought and sold stocks, and every year someone was moving out and someone was moving in, and now all these doors from who knows where were opening, and all sorts of strange people were around, people who looked more at home than she was, even the homeless ones who spoke no English, more at home maybe because they were younger. And when she went out, it seemed to her that she too had migrated, that everyone migrates, even if we stay in the same houses our whole lives, because we can't help it. We are all migrants through time. Thank you.
Thank you, Pankaj. Thank you, Mohsin. If you would both pull your microphones in so we'll be able to hear your responses. Hi, my name is Andy. I'm Director of Author Events. I think most of you know exactly how this works. You raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. Who would like to start us off? Yeah, there's somebody in back there on the left.
Hi there. Hi there. Thank you very much for coming and speaking today. This question is directed more towards Mr. Mishra, but I would love to hear the other speakers' thoughts. In your scholarship, have you seen anything in the Western canon according to or in line with an esoteric and an exoteric teaching? in your study of the Western canon? And more broadly, do you think that there is a natural right in politics? If not, why? Thanks.
A natural, you mean a natural right in politics, mean a conservative right? Or? Oh, natural right. I'm not quite sure I follow. Do you mind rephrasing that?
Do you think that there is, I guess it's more, I'm not as fully versed as in scholarship as you are, but would you say that there might be a, how would you say it, the right to, a Mailean right, a right that is not relative?
Oh, absolutely. The dignity of the individual, that is definitely not relative. That is, of course, the bedrock on which modern politics is founded. That is also something on which, from which springs Christianity. And of course, Christianity informs many of our modern principles and ideals. So yes, I think that is the one. Perhaps Mohsin has a different take.
I think that the dignity of the individual is a wonderful starting point, and from that flows many principles. That we should be equal on the basis of gender, that we should be equal regardless of our racial identity, our sexual identity, regardless of our religious belief system. And perhaps one element of that equality, which is, I think, insufficiently articulated at this moment, is that we should be equal on the basis of where we are born. I imagine that in 200 or 300 years from now, people will look back at this historical moment and think it's so strange that people thought because you were born in a place for no reason or cause of your own, not your choosing, that you had fundamental different values and rights and entitlements that came from that place of birth. I imagine that in 200 or 300 years, we'll look at this moment in history where if you're born in Mogadishu or you're born in Philadelphia, you have fundamentally different rights. With the same degree of perplexity and perhaps horror that we look at people from 200 years ago who thought that, if you were black or if you were white or if you were brown or if you were this, that meant something was fundamentally different about you. I think that also flows from the principle of human dignity and equality, and is desperately lacking in so much of our discourse about the world today.
Another question? Yeah, there's a lady about 4 rows back here, 5 rows.
Hi, thank you so much for wonderful book reading. My question is basically, it seems like just following up on Mohsin, your last comment, it seems like right to mobility has been infringed for so many people where they lived. For example, I, as a US citizen, I can travel to many parts of the world, but my sister who lives in Pakistan, she has to probably apply for a visa and wait 6 months before we can plan to go together. So what do you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I think,
it's not just like, the example I gave it, we just sort of take it for granted, but I'm just thinking more about it, and the right of mobility is sort of a human right as well.
No, I think that I would agree with you. I think that at this point, many of the features of the nation state are fundamentally at odds with the idea of equality. In other words, the borders that we impose. If the nation state were, look, America's a country. You can come to America, there's a waiting list, you have to go through a certain process, but eventually you go through that process and you become American, and that would be something that one could imagine is quite consistent with equality, but also accepts the fear of migration suddenly occurring and sort of has some buffers in place where it balances between the fear of the migration and the fundamental right, as you say, to mobility or equality. But we don't have that today. And that results in a certain crisis. It means that the people who say, populist leaders say we're not equal, actually. This whole equality thing is a sham. We know deep inside it's a sham. We think that really the real French people are equal. The real British people, the real Muslims, the real Americans are equal. That position begins to get more and more strength because the truth is they're right. At this moment, our laws suggest that that is in fact the case. And so direction of travel becomes important. We can say, yes, it's true. The real Muslim, in quotes, the real Frenchman, the real American are more equal than others at this moment. But we think that that's a mistake. Over time, we'd like to evolve to a situation where that is no longer the case. If that direction of travel is apparent, this becomes a lot less potent. But if you turn away from that direction of travel, as I think many countries and societies are toying with doing, then the charge of hypocrisy is very strong. And the person who says, no, equality is not what our society stands for. It stands for some essentialism, becomes very potent. But living in Pakistan, I can tell you, once you begin to say things like the real Muslim is the real Pakistani, you very quickly discover that nobody is real enough. Your police state comes into existence, it polices its own people, and none of its people satisfy its criteria. And first you remove this group, and then you remove that group, and then this, and then that, and then this, and then that, and you're left with no equality at all. And so that would be my response to what you've said there. And I think we have to all, as citizens in our countries and of the world, and as human beings, confront that. If we believe in equality, it means a direction of travel, and we better start getting comfortable with it. But I'd love to hear what Pankaj has to say about it, actually.
Oh, no, I agree. I mean, I think, far too many of our ideals are in conflict with each other. Once you promise mobility, let's say, even within the nation state, upward mobility, for instance, is a promise that has been made by 2 or 3 decades of economic growth, and of course the ideological promises that have accompanied that growth, that everyone will enjoy at some point, upward mobility. Why should that mobility then now not also be lateral? Why should it also not be geographical? Since capital is very mobile, why should labor not be mobile? And that is where the supposedly sovereign nation state starts to exercise its sovereignty by building walls, drawing up borders, and say, okay, we're going to take some of this, some part of this package, but not the other. And this contradiction Mohsin is talking about sort of opens up when equality and prosperity are then reserved for a certain group of people and denied to others. This contradiction is at the source of many problems today, right now.
There's a gentleman all the way in the back.
Thank you. I think my question's for Mohsin, but I'd like to hear generally as well. You mentioned nostalgia. I think you started talking off about nostalgia, and I think you recently wrote about nostalgia as well, and it's a very interesting concept. I'd like to sort of understand your views on how you feel, or what role you feel that plays in the characters of, say, the Nadia, and more generically, what role it plays in the outlook of immigrants in the real world today.
Well, so nostalgia is a very natural human emotion, or set of emotions, feeling. We are here temporarily. One day every human being ceases being. And so therefore, the time when we had more time to be is always beautiful in a way. There's an intrinsic bias towards thinking, then, when I only clocked in 20% or 30% of my hours, how great things were. But we recognize that despite that feeling, we can't really do anything about it. Transience is our nature. We are not sort of eternally human. We are human beings. And so cultures and societies and religions and different systems have grown up to allow us to navigate our transience, to find beauty in our transience, to find actually in the transient nature of life something incredible. The problem is that we now have undermined so many of those things. Religious systems that allowed us to navigate transience have been politicized to the point that they become in and out identification markers, thereby being less powerful, less potent as spiritual ways to navigate transience. Families have been dispersed geographically or shattered economically, and therefore don't have the same potency as they once did to help us navigate transience that, yes, I will go, but my grandchild will be. Racial, ethnic, national identities have been adulterated by miscegenation, by hybridity, by mongrelization. So the German folk, the eternal, 1,000-year German people, the Americanness, whiteness, Muslimness, seem suspect. They don't really, I can't say I'm okay dying because, Muslims will live on forever, or I'm okay dying because the white people will always be here. The potency of those things is much less than when our tribe really felt meaningful to us. So we're unmoored, and the pace of change is accelerating, and so nostalgia is becoming more and more potent. Our antibiotics in nostalgia have been overrun by an evolutionary cause of sort of nostalgic bacteria. And also the nostalgic bacteria, because of technology, is becoming incredibly more potent, much more quickly than it was before. And so what that suggests to me is, one, we should be very wary of nostalgic impulses, political impulses, which are all around us, because we're vulnerable. And secondly, we need to begin to articulate non-nostalgic or anti-nostalgic. We need the next generation of nostalgic antibiotics. And the sources of those antibiotics, may not be the pharmaceutical labs, the emotional pharmaceutical labs of, GlaxoSmithKline or whatever. It might be a lab based in Balkh in Afghanistan. It might be a lab based in, northern India or China. It might be in Latin America. For example, one interesting thing that we're seeing is that the current Pope has an incredibly non-nostalgic view of human existence. I'm not Catholic, but I find it admirable how he articulates a notion of human equality and a vision of how the world could go, which is profoundly non-nostalgic and generous in its outlook. We needn't all become, Pope Francis Catholics, but we do need to search far and wide for new things, new systems, new beliefs. Because the old system is reaching its apotheosis, right? If rational, economically maximizing humanity is what we really are at our core, the future is AI. How does that feel? Highly rational thing. Does that feel great? The future is the techno-futurism that we're seeing coming at us, and that makes us feel miserable. So I think that this question of nostalgia is very, very important. And as a novelist in particular, one of the things that we have, one of the many places we can go to develop our antibiotics against nostalgia is storytelling. Storytelling has always been there as a way to escape the tyranny of what was and what is, and to imagine what could be. And I think that that is one very rich vein to explore, but there are so many others. And they'll come from a very diverse set of sources, and actually it's desperately important that we begin to look for them, because otherwise what we're going to see is horrific carnage and backward-looking violence that seeks to deny our humanity and extinguish many humans along the way. But I'd love to hear what Pankaj has to say about this.
Oh no, I agree too much with this. I would say that nostalgia, yes, politically treacherous, as we can see in all kinds of attempts to retrieve or rediscover, recreate this, supposedly golden past, where, as you said, people knew their place and has just stayed there. But at the same time, I think the past, which can be accessed in any number of ways, including through historical scholarship or the past as it manifested in, say, the Catholic Church today, through certain rituals, through certain traditions. So nostalgia is not the only way of thinking about that past and retrieving some of its values that we seem to have lost in the last 3 decades, particularly the values of community, the values of solidarity, the values of feeling compassion for the weak, all these values that Pope Francis manifests more vividly than any politician or businessman or media pundit today. So I would still argue that there are things we have to learn from historical experiences, but of course, while being on guard against this very dangerous fantasy of going back to this supposedly unviolated wholeness that we all, whether Hindus in India or real Muslims in Pakistan or really, really white Americans in seem to want to go back to, because that is just a fantasy designed to cause suffering to a lot of people, including to the perpetrators.
I agree with what you're saying, and I think it's important to distinguish between the past as a kind of beacon that we seek to return to, and the past as a source of torches that can navigate where we might go. And there's a great deal of richness that has to be mined from the past, from different historical and cultural and political traditions that can take us forward. We don't need to reject the past, but we certainly mustn't return to it.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question. We just have a couple of minutes left. So who would like to ask that final question? There's a lady on our left here. Miriam, to your left. Yes.
Hi. I guess my question is more on the religions in Islam. I always wonder, why is Islam being so targeted today? I don't recall, 20 years, 30 years back hearing so much about Muslims, about Islams, and so why today is it such a popular, a big thing? It's all about, violence associated with Islam. And so can you try to explain why this is happening now?
And you've got to be able to do it in a minute each.
Well, we can talk about this afterwards, but I think, you can easily imagine someone asking a question in the late 19th century. Why are Jews being targeted? Why are Jews being made scapegoats for the sufferings inflicted by, say, an economy that's industrializing, that's throwing people out of work, that's inflicting mass suffering, and the suffering people are pointing to Jews and saying, you are the cause of our suffering. You are the people making it difficult for us to live our lives. You are the people engaged in some kind of transnational conspiracy against that. So one has to recognize that societies, when they experience crises, find easily identifiable culprits and scapegoats and turn them into essentially people responsible for everything that's happening to them, because it's too difficult, it's too complicated for them to understand these opaque forces of politics and economy that are actually radically disrupting their lives. That is one part of the answer, and I'll stop there.
Mohsin, did you want to say something quickly?
No, I think that's correct. I once went to a talk that Arundhati Roy gave in Pakistan, in Karachi. And she said, India and Pakistan is so often this talk of Kashmir. Kashmir is the problem. Kashmir is the problem between India and Pakistan, and it's a source of our dispute. She said, Kashmir is not the problem. Kashmir is the solution. The problem is lack of health care, inequality, no clean drinking water, complete inequality between the genders, victimization of minorities. These are the problems. Kashmir is a solution because it means we talk about something else. And I would say in that sense, Muslims aren't the problem, they're the solution. They're the way to not talk about what the real problems are in societies, like the United States.
Please join me in thanking our storytellers, Mohsin Hamid and Pankaj Mishra.